The Awakening from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 7. Underground. David's joints ached. He groaned as he tried to move his limbs. Everything was sore, like he had fallen asleep in an unnatural position. He did not feel like opening his eyes yet. The nightmare remained so vivid that he just needed to sleep it off. No, wait, he never got back home. Maybe he never left. Maybe he did go to bed last night and dreamt the whole thing. That was it. After all, none of it was possible anyway. That would mean he would have to apologize to Beth for leaving her all alone last night. He wondered how long she must have waited for him to show up, but he never did. She would be upset. David groaned and rolled over, pulling the covers up around him. Wait a minute, he thought. The bed didn't feel right. The bedclothes didn't feel right either. He thought hard, still refusing to open his eyes, fearing that everything he had seen. He tried to sort out what would prove this to him one way or another before he opened his eyes to face whatever was out there. He remembered going with Beth to the old mill. She had fallen through the floor. They were in a cave where they found Ben. He did not smell dirt right now, so he figured he probably was not in a cave. They ran home where he made an idiot of himself in front of her father. He was not afraid to admit that. He walked across the square when it occurred to him. He knew that there was something tangible he could use to prove to himself that it really happened. He knew that what he would be looking for would not be there. He bent his arm and touched his collarbone. Slowly he ran his hand back along his neck to feel for... His heart dropped. There they were. It was impossible, but also undeniable. He could feel them. 2 scabbed wounds. With a gasp, David sat up. He looked around the room. It was plain, with a combination of wooden and dirt walls, a bed, a nightstand with a lamp, a single door, and no windows. David looked back at the lamp. He leaned in close to find that the light within it was just like the light in the lamp he had seen in the cave with Beth. He hyperventilated as the fear and realization of the situation came upon him. Where was he? What was he doing here? The door opened, and an old man stood in the doorway. He was dressed all in black in a style that David had never seen. The fabric was well worn, but made extremely well so that whatever its age, it looked good. Looking to the man's face, David could see some years lay on him, but despite the man's apparent age, he looked like someone who could not be reckoned with. David panicked and moved away from him, falling off the bed. Not missing a beat, David stood and moved into a corner of the room. "Who are you? Where am I? What do you want with me?" David said, still shrinking into the corner away from the man in the doorway. The man did not move towards him, but only put up his hands. "My name is Zechariah," he said. "Just relax. I'm here to help you." "What did you do to me?" David demanded, still not moving from his corner. "Last night, you were injected with a serum that altered your physiology," Zechariah explained. "You are now a Fempiror." "A what?" David had never heard this word before either. It sounded like vampire, but after the slew of words thrown at him last night by the other person, this Zechariah was spewing strange words as well. How would he make sense of it all? Would he even need to? This seemed about as unlikely as Barleyman Witt's demon story. "Vampire?" David asked with his best guess. "Fempiror," Zechariah said again. One word descended from the other. "The serum does give us characteristics similar to the vampire of mythology, but you will find the Fempiror quite different from the myth you know." "I'll die before I drink anyone's blood," David said. He still had trouble believing it, but he had to say it. "And no one expects you to drink anyone's blood," Zechariah assured him. David relaxed a little. "Oh," was all he managed. He felt a little foolish jumping to such a conclusion. "I think you'll find that a lot of mythology is simply that," Zechariah continued. "As of now, you are no longer human, so you will have to adjust to a new style of life." Wait, what? This made no sense. How could he be no longer human? He felt the same as he had before. Despite the burning sensation he experienced last night, he felt no different today. If he was different somehow, he would figure it out and deal with it later. "When can I go home?" he asked. "You can't," Zechariah replied curtly. David was confused. "Why not?" he asked. "It's a violation of the Rostem Code," Zechariah replied. "Also, the human world lives in the sunlight, and that will kill you." David just stared at Zechariah. It was one thing for him to wake up in a strange place with a strange person who tells him he is no longer human, but this stranger not allowing him to go home was a little too much. If something happened to him, he needed to tell his family what happened. And even if this code will not allow him to stay, this man should at least allow him to say goodbye. None of this made any sense to him. "I don't—" He began to say understand, but the words failed him. He sighed and looked at the floor, his mind continuing to reel from all this. "What is your name?" Zechariah asked. David just realized the question never came up, but then he had been controlling the conversation, and he had not given Zechariah the chance to ask. "David Taylor," he answered. "I know this is hard, David," Zechariah said, sounding very reassuring again. David scoffed. If he knew, then he should allow David to go home. Zechariah continued, "You won't like me for this part, but I am a Rostem, and the code commands that I protect you. I will not allow you to hurt yourself or anyone else, so don't try to leave. Trust me on this." David shrugged. He wants me to trust him, David thought sarcastically. David felt kidnapped, and this old man wants his trust. If he went home, he would not hurt anyone. "Get some rest," Zechariah said. "We have a long night ahead of us." With that, Zechariah left David alone with his thoughts. David wondered what he meant by having a long night ahead of them. Of course, he was supposedly a night dweller at this point, or so the old man said, but how does he know? His family and friends should be safe for him, right? He was suddenly uncertain. After all, nobody came to protect him last night. Rufus attacked him. David even screamed, and yet this old man was able to take him away from town. And unless Zechariah fought his way out, no one stopped him at all. David realized he was alone. He was missing just like Ben was, but wherever this was, it was not the cave where he had found Ben. Was this old man Rufus' associate? Was this where Rufus took his victims eventually? He had to get out of here, but he knew he had to wait until the old man would not be watching. But would that time come? He had no idea where he was, nor would he know the way out once he got past the door. He did not even know if the townspeople would accept him once he got there. Were they even worried? He did not know. He sat back down on the bed and considered all of these things over and over. Could he get out? Was it worth going home? What if the old man was right? He stared at the floor and closed his eyes. A tear crept out and fell to the floor. David was not sure how much time had passed before he tried to leave. He quietly opened the door to his room and looked out. Outside his room appeared to be the heart of the house. A large, modestly furnished single room served as a living area with the kitchen and dining areas on the far side of it. Along the walls on one side were 2 more doors and a hallway that led away from him near the dining area. The same type of light that was in his room lit this larger room, except that these lights were on the walls in the form of sconces. David approached one of them, looking at it closely, wondering again how it worked, since there was no fire within it. He noticed lines on the wall behind it leading from one light to another, which connected to a button of some kind on the wall, and then along the floor and back down the hallway. He glanced back into his room, and found a similar line entering the room at the floor level, that went around his room to the lamp on the nightstand. Although he was very curious about this, he had also noticed that the large room was empty, so this might be his chance to get out of here. On the wall opposite the other doors was a single door with a latch on the inside. He assumed that was the exit. He crept out of his room, not bothering to close the door behind him. He walked softly across the room, his eyes fixed on the door that was the only thing standing between freedom and captivity. He reached for the door and slowly unlatched it. He pulled on the handle and light from the outside streamed in. The light reminded him that he had left his hat in the bedroom, but he knew he had no time to get it now. He had to leave while he had the chance. Suddenly, a hand bolted from behind and grabbed his wrist before he could fully open the door. David turned angrily to find Zechariah standing behind him. "You're not leaving, are you, David?" Zechariah asked. "I'm going home. You can't hold me here," David insisted. Zechariah nodded. "True," he said. "I can't. But if you go out there right now, you'll die." "I don't believe you," David shot back. "Really?" Zechariah said. Zechariah swung the door open. David looked out across a wide-open field, the sun shining across it. He wanted to run across it as fast as he could to get away from this lunatic, but Zechariah still held his wrist, and David was unable to break that iron grip. The door to this house was set back about 5 yards from a sort of cave-like exit. David could see grass on the sides of the opening, and the short passage leading to the door was well maintained and smooth. It still looked like dirt, but it was fashioned to the point of being as smooth as marble. The sun was off to one side of the exit, so David knew that the opening was facing either north or south, but since he did not know the time of day, he could not be certain of the direction yet. He realized that this house was a hole in the ground, much like what was under the old mill, but more established. Zechariah took a step toward the opening. David paused. When the door opened, the outside air felt unnaturally hot. It was summer, but it was not so warm yesterday. To add to that, it should not be so warm in the back of an underground tunnel. Zechariah turned to him. "Are you coming?" he asked. David nodded and followed Zechariah the handful of steps it took to reach where the light was just hitting the end of the tunnel. Zechariah stopped him, took David's hand, and moved it toward the light. "This will sting," he warned, and thrust David's hand into the sunlight, carefully keeping his own hand out of the light. Unlike the slow and confusing burn from the previous evening, this pain hit David full on like touching a pot that had been on the fire all day. It shot through him in a flash, and he howled in pain as the flesh on the back of his hand quickly turned red. The sun had burned him before, but this was happening 100 times faster. Zechariah released David's hand, and David dropped to the ground, cradling his hand to his belly. He glared angrily at Zechariah from the soft ground. Zechariah appeared unmoved. "Hate me if you want, but remember," Zechariah warned, "I could have let you leave." He walked back into his house and held the door open, waiting for David. David looked out into the sunlit field and then back down at his hand, which had the faintest trails of steam wisping off it. He stumbled to his feet and walked back inside. Zechariah closed the door. David held his hand out, examining the blisters growing on his deeply reddened skin, not only on the back of his hand, but under his nails, and even down the sides of his fingers. He closed his eyes and held his hand to his belly again. "Why?" he asked, truly perplexed. Zechariah walked to a chair in his living area. David watched him, but did not move. "I've seen men burst into flames running out into the sunlight when they couldn't take the darkness any more," Zechariah said. "I don't know why it harms us. It just does." "So we can't go out during the day at all?" David asked. "Sunlight," Zechariah clarified. "If there are clouds, you can go out. In fact, we have cloaks to cover us during the day if we need to move during that time. It's the sun specifically that hurts us." "What else will hurt me?" David asked. "Garlic, white oak, and I hope you're not fond of orange juice," Zechariah finished with a smirk. David scoffed, remembering what else he had heard about vampires. Except for the orange juice, something he had never heard of, this was all sounding very familiar, but very unbelievable. However, the proof was in his hand, or rather on the back of it. "Does that mean I'm immortal too?" he asked, looking sidelong at Zechariah. Part of him really hoped this was true. If he lived forever, he could go back for Beth, and they could still be happy together. There was a chance. "No," Zechariah said. "We can be killed in exactly the same ways as everyone else. We seem immortal to humanity because we live so much longer than they do." "Why?" David asked. He felt like he was asking a lot of questions, but Zechariah seemed more than willing to answer them. Besides, what else could he do? "Something about having a lower body temperature," Zechariah explained with a shrug. "I've never been clear on what that has to do with aging, but to give you an idea, when I was changed, I was your age, or not much older." David stared at him. They live longer, and this old man looked very old. "How old are you?" he asked, picking the obvious question. Zechariah looked at him without a trace of humor in his face. 410, he said. David's mouth dropped open in surprise. Was he serious? David could see that he was quite serious. 410? There was no way he could be that old. David looked away from him and tried to let this sink in. "So what else is different?" David asked. "You said I'm not human. What does that mean?" "Humanity lives during the daylight hours," Zechariah explained. "They are warm, live about 60 years. On average, they'll lift up to 100 pounds and could run from the town to the mill in about 10 minutes. You, on the other hand, are cold. You noticed how warm it was outside, yet it is no warmer than it was yesterday. One of your townsfolk would feel hot to your touch, and you would feel freezing to them. From your age, you could live at least 500 more years. You could easily lift that stove over there." Zechariah pointed to an old black iron stove that looked like it would take 4 or 5 men to move. "And," Zechariah continued, "you could make the run from town to the mill in a couple minutes at the most. You already know what sunlight does to you." David nodded. The evidence was in his hand. He just stared at it, the rest of Zechariah's words spinning around in his head. Strength, speed, long life, but a prohibition on going home. It was like a dream wrapped in a nightmare. Zechariah stood. "Please get some rest," he advised. "We have to go to Aram, the central Fempiror city. I need to talk to the council, and it's a long trip." David shook his head. "I don't understand," he said. "I don't expect you to," Zechariah replied. "We leave just after sunset." Zechariah remained standing where he was. David knew he had no choice but to go along with Zechariah wherever it caused him to end up. He turned back to the room he had awakened in not so long ago. The door stood open just as he had left it. He walked slowly into the room and closed the door. He looked at his hand again. It was all so impossible. How could some kind of serum have changed him into something that Zechariah refers to as no longer human? What else was out there for him to find out about? They were going to a Fempiror city. That meant there were more of them. A lot more of them. Enough to warrant a city and some kind of council. And who was this Zechariah? How did he fit into all of this? How did he relate to the Fempiror that changed him? He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. He hoped that maybe it was all a really bad dream, and the next time he woke up, he would be back in his own room, ready to take the punishment for sneaking out to be with Beth. He thought about Beth, and what would happen to her if all this was real. Would she be able to move on with her life? Would she try to find him? Or would she, like the rest of the town had last night, abandon him forever? Zechariah watched as David closed the door. He was sure that at the very least the boy would not try leaving during the day. So many questions, and he knew that there would be many more before the first few days were done with. There was a lot to know about this life, and based on their first conversation, David Taylor was going to be difficult. The only thing that would make this more difficult would be his having someone special in his life that he would have to leave behind. Those were always harder. He turned from David's room and walked toward the short hallway past his kitchen that separated a small room from the rest of his house. He had a lot on his mind, more than just David. It was more or less what David represented in his world. He was not changed by some rogue in the middle of nowhere. He was changed by a tapish with the acquisition rank of Redel Kurtz. Where there was one of those, there were more, and that meant trouble. He entered the room that contained a seat on the floor in front of a wooden pedestal in the center of the room. A plain Christian cross rested on top of the pedestal, which was positioned in the room beneath a hole in the ceiling that allowed the sun to shine directly upon it at certain times of the day, but not on the seat. Zechariah entered the room and knelt with both knees on the seat. He folded his hands and bowed his head. "Father in heaven, please be with this child through this difficult time in his new life. And Lord, help us all if the tapish have truly returned." Abraham sat on the front bench of the town hall with his father and mother on his right. On his left were Jonathan and Mary Taylor, along with David's brothers James and Mark. On the bench across the center aisle were Beth Carpenter and her family. Behind him, the hall was full. Everyone in town had shown up for this, and for good reason. He looked to the small stage at the front of the hall. Gerald Hoggins IV was a plump little man with a round face and a body to match. He was overdressed for the town, wearing an expensive suit that the Taylor family certainly did not make, as one could not even find the materials in this part of the country. He stood up and waddled to the lectern in the center of the stage. While the mayor was typically known for his jolly nature, today he looked positively downcast, along with many of the townsfolk. A glance to David's mother showed her face tear-stained and blotched from crying since this morning. Beth did not look much better. "Friends and neighbors," Mayor Hoggins began. 2 days ago, Ben Thurman disappeared. Most people attributed the disappearance to Ben's demeanor. We all know he has disappeared before. Many of the townsfolk nodded at this. The mayor continued. However, last night a greater tragedy occurred. David Taylor, the youngest son of Jonathan Taylor, never returned home. David's mother choked back a wail and buried her face in Jonathan's shirt. He put his hand reassuringly around her. Abraham had been trying not to cry. The reminder forced him to choke back his emotions and take a few deep breaths. He glanced quickly at his parents. His mother had been crying, of course. After all, David was his cousin, their nephew. The mayor looked out over the audience. He appeared to be having trouble with the next part of his speech. "This morning, just east of the Taylor family business, we found the—" And the mayor broke off for a moment. He took a deep breath. Abraham had heard what they'd found, and the very thought forced him to stifle back the tears again. The mayor continued. "Charred. Remains of a person. Based on the size of the remains, we can only surmise that these are the remains of David Taylor." Finally, Mary lifted her head and wailed. Jonathan held her tightly in his arms, and she dropped her head back into his shirt. Abraham looked at Beth, who was actively crying and leaning on her father, Patrick. Even his stern face had a softened look today as he comforted his daughter. "The last person to see David alive," the mayor continued, "was Miss Elizabeth Carpenter. Despite the impropriety implied in David and Beth being out together, the people of the town forewent any comments or indication of their opinions. The mayor continued. Her parents indicated that she and David had discovered Ben Thurman in a cave by the old Miller place. Mr. Tibbets had gone out to this cave with some men earlier. Mr. Tibbets, would you please relay the results of that discovery? Yes, Mayor Hoggins. Everyone turned to find Mr. Tibbets, a skinny man in his 40s at the back of the hall leaning against the wall. He looked unhappy with what he had to do recently, and really looked like he would rather be somewhere else. Generally, Tibbets could be found hunting or fishing far outside of town, and he only came into town to sell the meat of his catches to the local grocer, who sold them in town immediately. There was usually a very high demand for Tibbets' wares. Tibbets stepped away from the wall and barely made eye contact with the mayor as he spoke. We went out to the area described by Miss Carpenter and found a cave where we discovered more charred remains we believe may have been Ben Thurman. In the cave we found a small area that looked lived in, and there was a broken lantern on the floor. Thurman may have knocked it over in a struggle. The mayor nodded. He looked back out to the crowd that turned back to him. Friends and neighbors, while some rumors of demons and vampires may be about, we can be certain that there is danger in Hogginstown at night. I must reiterate, do not go out after dark until we are sure this matter is resolved. During the day, travel in pairs at a minimum. The mayor took another deep breath. Funerals for our departed brethren will be tomorrow afternoon. God be with you all through this difficult time. He stepped back from the lectern and sat down, where he removed a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. Abraham looked over to where Beth was sitting. The people were all standing and leaving at this point, so it was difficult to see her. He stood up and saw her father and mother leading her out. He hoped to see her soon to find out what they saw out there last night. For now, though, he knew he would be going home. Perhaps tomorrow.